Ever wish you could, like, bottle up centuries of philosophical thought? Distill it down to, like, one potent sip. That's kind of what we're aiming for today in our deep dive.
We are indeed. Today we're going deep into the world of Philodemus of Cadara.
Philodemus.
An Epicurean philosopher and poet. Flourished roughly, let's say, between 110 and 30 BCE.
Okay, so way back.
And, what's especially fascinating about him is the way we get to access his ideas. It's really direct.
Oh.
Yeah, it's kind of unique. Unlike a lot of ancient thinkers whose work we know through, layers of interpretation and commentary.
Right.
But Philodemus, we've got these primary sources.
Straight from the source.
Exactly. Papyrus manuscripts, remarkably preserved, buried by Vesuvius in 79 CE.
Oh, wow, the eruption.
The one and only Herculaneum, stepping back in time almost.
It's like we're peeking right into his library.
It really is. We're not dealing with texts copied and recopied over centuries, where things can get, lost in translation.
Oh, I see. No scribal errors or anything.
Right. These papyri, they give us a much more immediate connection,
to his actual thinking.
Exactly. His arguments, the whole intellectual atmosphere of his time.
And Philodemus himself he led a pretty interesting life, didn't he?
He did. Honed his philosophical skills in Athens under Zeno of Sidon, big name in the Epicurean school. Then he ends up in Italy.
Really?
Yeah, rubbing shoulders with prominent Romans, like L. Calpurnius Piso Caesanus, for instance.
Okay, so connected. And didn't Cicero mention him somewhere?
He did. Cicero actually talked about Philodemus's poetry, called it witty, elegant, even though philosophically they were on different pages.
Right, so a recognized talent, even among those who disagreed with him. So, we're not trying to present Philodemus as some philosophical rock star,
No, not at all.
Someone who's going to, overturn everything we thought we knew.
Right.
Instead, what we're doing today is we're really diving deep into his work and why it matters.
Exactly.
Because he gives us this amazing viewpoint into Epicureanism.
A unique perspective, really.
Right, and how it interacted with all these other ideas floating around at the time.
The whole intellectual landscape of the Hellenistic period.
So we'll be unpacking a few things today. His role as an interpreter of Epicurus himself.
Back to the source.
Right. And then how he grappled with those other schools of thought. The Stoics, and so on.
The debates, the disagreements, it's all there.
And finally, how he tried to, ground these Epicurean ideals in everyday life.
The practical application. That's crucial for Philodemus.
So let's jump in. Now, you mentioned before that Philodemus really saw himself as an interpreter.
Oh, absolutely. He was very conscious of that role. Dedicated to explaining, transmitting the core teachings of Epicurus and those early Epicureans. People like Metrodorus from Marcus.
Staying true to the original message.
Absolutely. And he had immense respect for his own teacher, Zeno of Sidon.
And it sounds like Zeno really shaped his approach.
Yeah.
Especially how Philodemus dealt with those original texts.
Oh, hugely. Zeno was all about meticulously collecting, studying those early Epicurean writings. And, what we'd call philological exegesis. A really close, detailed analysis.
Okay, so not just reading, but truly dissecting the language. The nuances.
Precisely. And Philodemus, he took that to heart. He saw that rigor as essential for, safeguarding the school's doctrines.
Protecting them from misinterpretations, I guess?
In a way, yes. Keeping that core message intact. Because, within Epicureanism itself, different interpretations were cropping up.
People putting their own spin on things.
Exactly. And there was this tension, you could say, about how to engage with the source material. Some people favor those original in-depth texts.
Makes sense. Right from the horse's mouth, as they say.
Right. While others preferred, let's say, the condensed versions, epitomes, compendia.
Ah, the Cliff's Notes approach.
Exactly. Get to the essence quickly. And Philodemus, he firmly planted himself in the first camp.
Team original text.
Absolutely. He believed that deep engagement with those complete works, Epicurus and his earliest followers, that was crucial. And for him, it wasn't just an academic exercise. It was about the health, you could say, of the Epicurean school as a whole.
A community of thought.
Exactly. A shared understanding of these principles and a way to, uphold what he called Epicurean orthodoxy, the correct, established interpretation.
Okay, so this wasn't just about personal understanding. It was about maintaining the integrity of the school itself.
Exactly. And that, played into how they responded to other schools of thought, the Stoics and so on, all those competing ideas out there. But here's the thing. The reason we can even have this conversation about his interpretations
is because of those incredible papyri.
Right. It's an archaeological miracle almost.
It's like a time capsule, isn't it?
Totally. That discovery in the mid-18th century, the Villa of the Papyri, it was a game changer. I mean, imagine unearthing this huge collection of scrolls, but they're incredibly fragile.
Oh, right. They're like charred, aren't they? From the heat of the eruption.
Exactly. Carbonized. So this initial excitement, finding this lost library, it's followed by this huge challenge. How do you even handle them?
It's like finding this priceless ancient book, but it's like made of ash.
Yeah, a great analogy.
Yeah.
But the thing that makes them so valuable, especially for understanding Philodemus, is their age.
They're from his time.
They are contemporary or very close to it.
Huh.
So it's like a direct line, to his own writing. Not like with other philosophers, where we rely on copies made centuries later.
And even reading these papyri, it's a whole story in itself.
Oh, it is. Early attempts, they often cause more damage trying to unroll them.
Crumbling to dust.
It's taken, centuries of work. From those early mechanical methods to, these cutting-edge techniques we have now, multispectral imaging, things like that.
Where they use light to, reveal the faded ink.
Precisely. It's been revolutionary for deciphering these texts and what it's shown us about the library's contents.
Well, it sounds like an Epicurean treasure trove.
It is. The vast majority, they're philosophical treatises. And Philodemus, alongside Epicurus, they're the most frequent authors. But, and this is interesting, there were also works by other Epicureans.
Keeping it in the family.
Right. But also some from other schools of thought. Like, for instance, Chrysippus. He was a Stoic.
Oh, so there was some variety in there.
There was.
Us.
Which suggests, this engagement with other viewpoints.
Keeping an open mind, maybe.
Or perhaps, just the owner's broad intellectual curiosity.
Speaking of which, there's been a lot of debate about who actually owned the Villa of the Papyri.
Oh, yeah. A lot of ink spilled on that one.
Was it Philodemus himself?
Well, the main theory is that it belonged to the family of L. Calpurnius Piso.
The Roman you mentioned earlier, right? Philodemus's patron.
Exactly. There's evidence. Busts, statues, with connections to Piso. But the construction date of the villa, as we estimated, it's around 40 BCE. And Cicero places Philodemus with Piso much earlier, around 55 BCE.
So the timeline gets a little fuzzy.
It does. So maybe Philodemus lived there for a while. Maybe not.
So we can't definitively picture him there, surrounded by his scrolls.
Not with absolute certainty. It's likely the collection was at least partly his. But whether he was a permanent resident, whether it was a center for his work, that's still up for debate. The way the books were stored, some seem untouched, adds to the mystery.
It's like an ancient detective story.
A bit, yeah. Now, his poetry, we knew about that.
Right, passed down through anthologies.
But those papyri, they revealed this whole other side to him.
His philosophical writings.
Exactly. And it's a side we're still reconstructing. You see, a lot of the scrolls are missing their title pages, beginnings and ends.
Oh, no.
And a lot of his works were multi-volume. So piecing it all back together, it's a huge challenge.
Like a giant jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces?
That's it. We know he wrote these massive treatises on death, on music, on rhetoric, on poems, on the gods, and then there's on vices, a really substantial work. But what we have are often just fragments, incomplete sections.
So frustrating.
It is. But even these fragments, they give us precious insights into his thinking. Take on Music 4, for instance. What's fascinating there is how he directly takes on Diogenes of Babylon, who was a Stoic, refuting his arguments about the ethical influence of music.
Head-to-head with another school of thought.
Exactly. And similarly, on Poems First, he's critiquing Cretes of Malos, this literary theorist, and other critics of poetry at the time, really engaging in these intellectual debates.
Not just presenting Epicurean ideas, but defending them.
Exactly. And it gets even more pointed in Rhetoric 8. He dissects and then rejects this statement attributed to Aristotle about why Aristotle taught rhetoric. He even uses these reductio ad absurdum arguments, to kind of poke holes in it.
It makes these ancient figures feel so much more real, like they were actually sparring with each other.
They were. But, beyond these theoretical debates, Philodemus also got into the nitty-gritty of living as an Epicurean.
Putting those ideas into practice.
Right. Especially in his ethical writings. This is where you really see that focus on pleasure as the goal.
The heart of Epicureanism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But he doesn't spend a lot of time, justifying it.
Yeah.
He takes those basic principles for granted.
He's like, okay, we all agree on this. Let's move on.
Yeah. And so you have works like On Choices and Avoidances.
Yeah.
Which sounds like, a beginner's guide to Epicurean ethics.
Making decisions, figuring out what to pursue, what to avoid.
Exactly. How to navigate life, essentially.
Mm.
And then there's this big project on vices, this multi-volume work.
It sounds ambitious.
Very. He systematically goes through all these vices, and then he pairs them with their corresponding virtues.
Okay, so like for every bad habit, there's a good one to cultivate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he even describes the types of people, who embody these traits. We know some of the book titles. On flattery, on arrogance. And some of these books were actually dedicated to Roman poets.
Oh, wow. Like Virgil and Friends of Horace.
Right. So it wasn't just abstract moralizing. It was grounded in real life, real people. He may have even been giving his poet friends material, for their work.
Character studies, almost.
Exactly. A way to understand human nature. Now, another interesting aspect of Epicureanism is this practice of frank criticism.
Being honest, even if it's tough to hear.
That's it. And Philodemus, he wrote a whole treatise on it, on frank criticism, or in Greek, parrhesia. And it's not just about, bluntness. It's a skill. It's about diagnosing moral failings, providing guidance, what they call therapy.
A way to help each other grow.
Exactly. And the sage, the leader, had a key role. They had to be able to, read people.
Understand their weaknesses.
Right. But it wasn't just top down. Everyone was expected to, examine themselves, offer feedback to each other.
So a culture of continuous self-improvement. Did they ever, fight?
I'm sure there were disagreements.
Yeah.
But the goal was, to help each other attain that Epicurean ideal.
Yeah.
And Philodemus, he also tackled those big universal emotions. We have his works on anger and on death the first.
Let's start with on anger. What's the Epicurean take on that?
Well, he draws on Epicurus's ideas about desires. And he makes this distinction between natural anger and empty anger.
Okay, so there's good anger and bad anger.
In a way, yes. Natural anger, it's proportionate, a response to genuine harm. But empty anger, that's irrational. Excessive rage, it comes from false beliefs.
Letting your emotions get the best of you.
Exactly. And he even argued with other Epicureans about this, like Timagoras, who thought all anger was bad.
So, lively debate, even within the school itself.
There was. And then, on death fourth, it's all about facing that fear. He uses those classic Epicurean arguments.
Like, we don't experience anything after death, so why fear it?
Exactly. No sensation, no good or bad. And dying early, well, it's not a problem if you've lived well. But he's also sensitive to, those natural feelings of grief.
When we lose loved ones, especially.
Right. He distinguishes that from those irrational fears.
Yeah.
Like worrying about what people will say after you're gone.
Or the whole, fire and brimstone thing.
Exactly. So it's a nuanced view. Human, you could say. Now, we've talked about these different schools of thought, and there's this idea that Epicureans rejected the traditional Greek education.
The liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, all that.
Right. Epicurus himself favored coming to philosophy with a clean slate, so to speak. But Philodemus, he had a more, let's say, refined take on it.
He saw some value in them.
He did. He thought you could enjoy the arts, with some basic knowledge. But he drew the line at that deep, technical study, the kind that professionals devoted their lives to.
It's like, dip your toes in, but don't get swept away.
Right. He saw it as a potential distraction from the pursuit of philosophy, which was the ultimate goal. So with music, for example, on Music 4, he criticized the amount of practice it took to become a skilled musician.
All those hours spent rehearsing, perfecting technique?
Yeah, time that could be spent on philosophy, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And he also argued against those music theorists who said that music itself had this, ethical power.
That certain melodies could make you a better or worse person.
Exactly. Philodemus thought that any influence came from the lyrics, not the music itself. And then with poetry, which is interesting given that he was a poet himself.
Right, a bit ironic.
He said poetry should imitate clear, useful language, address themes that everyone could understand, wise and, not so wise people.
Reaching a broader audience.
Right. He wasn't a fan of, overanalyzing poetry, getting lost in all the technicalities. He thought that could actually diminish your enjoyment.
Just appreciate it for what it is.
That was his view. And with rhetoric, he was quite critical of the political and legal kind, using speech to sway crowds or win cases. He wasn't convinced it was a true art, and he thought it could actually be harmful to happiness. But he did see value in what he calls sophistic rhetoric.
Okay, so that's more about, performance, crafting speeches, being eloquent.
Exactly. He recognized it as a skill, a techne, but not something that should consume an Epicurean's life. For them, true rhetoric was that frank criticism we talked about.
So it all comes back to those core principles.
It does, living in accordance with nature, seeking pleasure and tranquility. Now, we've covered his views on ethics, the arts, but what about his thoughts on, the big questions, theology, history?
Right. What did Philodemus have to say about those?
Well, he definitely had opinions. On the gods and on piety, he took issue with those popular ideas about the divine, the ones that often filled people with fear.
The vengeful gods, all that.
Exactly. He defended Epicureanism against charges of atheism. He argued that the gods, they were perfectly blissful, detached beings. And understanding this, it could actually help us achieve happiness, that state of ataraxia, freedom from worry.
Interesting. The gods as role models.
In a way, yes. And his historical works, like the collection of the Philosophers, they're important too. They give us insights into how ancient thought developed.
Tracing the lineage of ideas.
Exactly. That work, it was a major source for Diogenes Laertius, who wrote about Epicurus. And from the Herculaneum library, we've also found fragments of Philodemus' studies of the Platonic Academy and the Stoa.
So he wasn't just focused on his own school of thought.
No. But he also paid a lot of attention to the history of Epicureanism itself. Works like On Epicurus, Epicurean Memoirs, documenting their own tradition. So, maybe Philodemus wasn't this groundbreaking innovator when it came to the core doctrines.
He wasn't trying to reinvent Epicureanism.
Right. But his work gives us this incredibly detailed, rich picture of how it interacted with the world around it, how those ideas were lived, debated, defended.
So what about his influence on later thinkers? Did he leave a mark?
That's a good question. Now, because Epicureans really emphasized sticking to the founder's teachings, Philodemus wasn't part of those big philosophical syntheses of his time.
Like trying to blend different schools of thought together.
Right, and we don't find a ton of direct citations of his work in antiquity. Diogenes Laertius is an exception, of course, but there are hints of his influence in people like Cicero and Sextus Empiricus.
Possible echoes of his arguments.
Exactly. And in more recent times, thinkers like C.S. Peirce, they've engaged with his work. And even scholars studying early Christianity, they found his insights into the organization of Epicurean schools quite interesting.
It helps them understand how those early Christian communities were structured.
Exactly. So maybe he's not a household name in philosophy.
But his legacy endures through these incredible texts.
They really are remarkable. They give us this firsthand look at how Epicureanism was practiced in the late Hellenistic period. His thoughts on ethics, epistemology, aesthetics, you name it, and those glimpses into the life of their philosophical community.
It's like a window into a lost world.
It is. And it reminds us that to really understand a philosophy, you have to look at those who interpreted it, debated it, lived it.
The people who wrestled with those ideas in their own time.
Exactly. So a final thought for you, our listener. Think about Philodemus, striving for pleasure and peace, but also actively engaging in all these intellectual battles.
Trying to find that balance.
Right. What can we learn from that today? In our own lives,
Yeah.
We're bombarded with information, all these demands on our time.
So much to process, to worry about.
What baggage, so to speak, are we carrying that might be holding us back from true happiness? What can we let go of?
Really makes you think. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of Philodemus, a real reminder of the power of primary sources. And even those thinkers who saw themselves as interpreters, they can offer incredible insights.
Absolutely. They enrich our understanding of a whole tradition. So if you're interested in learning more, check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Their entry on Philodemus is a great place to start. It'll help you delve even deeper into those treasures from the Villa of the Papyri.
Thanks for joining us today, and until next time, keep seeking that good life.
And don't forget to critically examine those who claim to have found it.